Welcome, everyone. This morning, we're going to start with a land acknowledgement. At this time, we want to take a moment to reflect on the lands on which we reside. We are coming from many places, and we want to acknowledge the ancestral homelands and traditional territories of the indigenous peoples who have been here since time immemorial, and to recognize that we must continue to build our solidarity and kinship with Native peoples across the Americas and across the globe. San Diego Mesa College is built on the ancestral homelands of the Kumeyaay people, and we acknowledge and honor their tremendous contributions to our region and thank them for their stewardship, past, present, and future. Please join me in a collective breath. As all of our liberation is tied together, and so is our history, we also acknowledge that this country was built up from the free enslaved labor of Black people, and we honor the legacy of the African diaspora. We honor the legacy of Black life, knowledge, and skills stolen due to violence and white supremacy. With this acknowledgement, we recognize a duty to give honor through our work and continue to stand up for racial and social justice every day. We also recognize the tragic aggression occurring in Ukraine, with Russia invading their independent historical homeland, and we stand in solidarity with the brave people of Ukraine and with those affected. Please join me in a moment of silence as we hold Ukraine in our hearts and minds. Thank you, and thank you for coming. My name is Wendy Smith, and I am one of the facilitators for today's event, which is being recorded to share with those who are unable to attend. Please fill out our survey. The link is in the chat. This helps us learn more about our audience and improve what we do. Our Ethnographer Speaker Series continues through the month. Next Friday, we feature Dr. Jennifer Syme, Mesa College anthropology professor. The series began when I was researching ways to teach English that are immediately relevant to students' lives and careers, that would take advantage of their lived experience and observational powers, because as we know, students bring a lot to the table. My talented co-creator, Katlin Choi, suggested that I include an ethnographer visit. So I started contacting researchers to talk to my students, and before I knew it, we had a whole series. Today we are excited to present sociology professor and author of the book, Growing Up Queer, Kids and the Remaking of LGBTQ Identity, Dr. Mary Robertson. Welcome, Mary. Shall we get started?
Hello. Hello. Thank you so much, Katlin and Wendy, and all of those of you who are students at Mesa or otherwise. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being here. It's always an honor and a really profound pleasure to talk about this book, and it's something that I'm proud of in terms of the work that I've done, but really it was a wonderful experience that I did in collaboration with a bunch of other people, and it's just a joy to be able to share it with people. So thank you all for being here. So you can call me Mary. You can call me, some of my students call me Dr. Mary. You can call me Dr. Robertson if that's really important to you, but just know that I'm okay with all of those names. I use she pronouns. They is also perfectly acceptable when you're talking about me. I'm coming to you from my home in Seattle, Washington, where it is gray and rainy out today. Contrary to popular belief, it's not always rainy in Seattle, but it's often rainy in Seattle, and today it is rainy. So I live with my partner Robert and our two cats, Albert and Ph.D., and I am a lecturer at Seattle University in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And I just wrapped up my quarter. I was teaching a class, what we call at Seattle University UCORE, which are classes that everybody has to take. So I have a lot of freshmen, but it's a social science class that people who are non-social science majors take. And this class is called Sex, Love, and Marriage. And so we look at that topic through the lens of sociology. And I also just taught a sociological and feminist theory class. So I have a lot of grading to do this week and a little bit of a break before I go back next quarter. So I'll just tell you a little bit about what I like to do. I love to hike. I love to be outside. That's kind of my main jam. I really love to read. I love to eat. And I love music. I'm learning how to play the drums. I've been a drummer for about 1.5 years, and that's pretty important to me too. So, so to start, I'll tell you a little bit about my education, sort of how I found my way to sociology, and then we'll talk a little bit about the book, and we'll go from there. So I was my path to college education was what most people would call, the term we like kind of use is non-traditional path to college. So I graduated from high school and decided that I was not ready to go off to college, although it was not unusual among my friends that people did go. It was a little bit mixed. Like I had a sister that went away to a 4-year college and lived in a dorm and did that kind of thing. And then I had a sister who didn't go to college and who eventually went to cosmetology school and took a professional training route. And, among my friends, it was a bit mixed too. Some people went right away to college, but a lot of my friends didn't. So I worked I always tell people I've been a professor for far less time than I've been a sociologist for far less time than I've been a restaurant and bar worker. Like I spent 25 years of my life waiting tables, working in bars, running concert venues, doing that kind of thing. And that really is what I did most of my life. But when I was in my late 20s, so I was 28 years old when I decided that I wanted to go back to college. And what happened was that I felt like there were all these things about the world that I didn't understand enough of. I was curious. I liked to pay attention to what was happening in the world. I was becoming more and more interested in feminism, and I really found feminism through music, through feminist musical artists, and but I realized I didn't understand history, and I didn't understand politics, and I felt like I needed more information to be able to sort of understand the world. And so that's when I was like, okay, I think I'm going to go to college, because I think that's where I would meet people who are in college and be like, oh, they are smart and they know things and they understand some things that I don't understand. And I think, college might be the place for me to get that. So I lived in Denver at the time, which I forgot to say is my hometown. I grew up in Denver, Colorado. And there was there's a college there it's now called Metropolitan State University of Denver. At the time it was Metropolitan State College, because at the time there were no graduate programs. And this was a urban campus commuter college. There were no dorms. Most of the students who went to school there were, as I described, what we would call, I don't know if we still use that term, that non-traditional students, meaning they didn't start college at 18. And it was actually a shared campus. It's called Auraria campus, and Metropolitan State College was there, but the Community College of Denver was also there. And then a campus of the University of Colorado. And so, although it wasn't a community college, it was, I think Metro, when I started there at 28, was much closer to probably what Mesa is now. So, there's been a lot of revisioning of community college. And I think, so I say that because I think my experience was really quite similar in terms of sort of beginning my foray into college, but it wasn't a community college. It was a 4-year college. And so I knew I wanted to learn. I wanted to go into women's studies. Like, that was very clear to me. I was very interested in feminism and so I purposely went and met with someone in the women's studies department and said, I want to major in this, and can you tell me how to get started? And that's how I found my way back into college. And so I attended school, and I worked and went to school for those 4 years that I was attending school at Metro State, and just became I became very interested in feminism. I became very interested in sort of efforts towards anti-sexism and anti-racism. I became politicized. At the time, it was the time of the, it's kind of a post 9/11 world. The United States was initiating war in Iraq, and there was an anti-war movement happening. There was a lot of queer pride stuff happening on my campus. And so I became an activist at the same time that I became a college student. And I loved it. I loved being in college. I very much loved learning. I loved this kind of exploring all these topics, like I said, that I had felt like I didn't understand completely until I went back to college. And in women's studies is an interdisciplinary major, which means you do a whole mix of different disciplines. So there would be some literature and some history and some political science and some sociology, and you'd get exposed to all these different things. And interestingly, I never took a sociology class the whole time I was an undergrad, but I took some political science classes, and I had a professor in the political science department who explained to me what it meant to get my PhD. And I didn't understand. I knew what an MD was, a doctor, but I didn't really understand what a PhD was. I didn't really know what a person with a PhD did, other than I was starting to figure out that my professors had PhDs. And so this professor of mine who met, saw in me this potential to go on and sort of be an academic, explained, well, this is what a PhD is. And, people with PhDs spend, 6 years or so, 6 or more years studying very specifically a particular topic in a particular discipline. And then they do a research project, and then you go and, if with any luck, you become a professor. And you should do it because you are interested in these things and you would be good at it. And this is what she told me, so, it's that idea of until someone tells you what's possible, you don't know, and you don't know what these route paths are and these different ideas of how people get places. And so, but once I thought, and like, I think many of you can relate to this, but I most definitely admired there. I had a couple of professors that I really admired and who I wanted to be like. And I don't know about you, but Wendy Smith is one of those people that I am like, oh, I want to be more like Wendy Smith. But you have these professors and these people who touch your life, and you're like, I want to be like them. And that's really, honestly, that was what happened to me. This professor of mine, her name is Dr. Anna Sampaio. She's a political scientist. Arlene Segudas was another professor of mine in women's studies. And, I just thought these people are cool, and I like being on a college campus. Like, that's also a cool place to be. So when I graduated, I kept my restaurant job, and I kept working at the restaurant because actually that was like the best money I could make, far better than going and getting kind of an entry level job somewhere in a nonprofit or something. So I kept waiting tables, but I had in this back of my mind, this idea of like, I think I want to go get my PhD. So I just took a couple years to think about it, and then decided to start applying to grad school and looking into grad school. And people ask me, how did you become a sociologist? And it's actually far less romantic than you might think. But what happened was that I lived in Denver and I needed to stay in Denver. And so that limited me. I had to pick from a PhD program that I could commute to from my home. So that, and that there were very few, unlike California, where there's so many universities, in Colorado, there's fewer. And so that meant that I could go to the University of Colorado, which was in Boulder, and it meant I could go to the Colorado State University, which was in Fort Collins, but that was farther away. And then I was not, even though I did my undergrad in women's studies, I was concerned that wouldn't give me as many opportunities when I finished. If I did a PhD in women's studies, there's very, very few people who are PhDs in women's studies, and there's very, very few jobs as professors in women's studies, especially at the time. And I was concerned that I wouldn't be able to get a job. So I needed a discipline that was a bit broader. And I had a friend, again, this is a friend of mine who was a sociologist, and this is a guy who was in a band with my partner, and he sat down with me and he said, I think you'd be a really good sociologist and you should apply to this program that he was a graduate student in at the time. And so he's really the reason it was sociology. I mean, I had kind of been exploring sociology unintentionally. I didn't know that I was sort of looking at sociology as a women's studies major, but I so I couldn't put my finger on it, but he was able to see my interests and who I was and say, you'd be a good sociologist. The other discipline I was interested in was anthropology. And so I also applied for a cultural anthropology graduate school. So I applied. So I settled on the University of Colorado Boulder because geographically it was where I needed to be. And I applied to anthropology and I applied to sociology. And the anthropology department accepted me for a master's degree with no money. And the sociology department accepted me to a PhD program and they gave me money. So the reason I'm a sociologist is that they gave me money and the anthropology department didn't. So that, I mean, these are kind of how these decisions get made, right? You need to make a practical decision for your life and your best interests, as well as, follow your passions and follow your heart. And so I did I never got a master's degree, which is a little unusual. It's becoming more and more unusual. Oftentimes people get a master's first and then they get a PhD. You don't have to do that. It depends on the discipline you're in. But in many cases, you can go straight into a PhD program, so that's what I did. So it was a 6-year, it took me 6 years. And during that time I studied, but I also was a teaching assistant. And then eventually I was a graduate student instructor. So I taught classes the whole time in college and then learned, studied and wrote and researched at the same time. And so when you do a PhD, you do what's called a dissertation, which is a very big research project where you do your own empirical research on a topic. And that's sort of the culminating proof that you earn your PhD is through your dissertation. And so I did an ethnography of an LGBTQ youth drop-in center, as some of you know, because you may have read a little bit about it. That was my PhD dissertation. And I was interested in the social construction of gender and sexuality. And I was exploring how do we become gendered sexual persons. And so that was my research question. And I did an ethnography, which meant that I spent a lot of time in this space with the young people and the staff who were also in this space. And I hung out and I watched and I observed and I did what's called taking field notes, where you kind of keep track of what you see and what you notice and what happens. And then I also did semi-structured life history interviews with about 35 young people. And those things came together, the interviews and my observations came together ultimately into the book. And I'm happy to answer questions. That's a big leap from the beginning to the end of there. But if you all, if people want questions about sort of how I did it, we can talk about that. And so that was my dissertation, which I shared with my committee of 5 people. And I had to demonstrate that I could design this research project, conduct this research project, and write an analysis. But then I graduated and I got a job at Cal State San Marcos, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with in North County. And many people who do ethnography turn that research into books. That's a very typical pathway for doing an ethnography. It's not the only way. You can also do ethnographic research and not turn it into a book, but it's very common, particularly in sociology and anthropology, that ethnographies become monographs or books. And so while I was teaching at Cal State San Marcos, I took all of that research that I had done and what I had written for my dissertation and edited it and reworked it and kind of rewrote it into a book form, which is what you read. And ultimately with the goal of making it more, a dissertation is not as much fun to read for various reasons that aren't really important, but the book, I needed to make it more readable so that, for example, college students at a school like Mesa could pick it up and read it and it would make sense to them. And so that's how the book came to be. And I'm we can talk more about that idea. And I'll tell you, one of the things, I'll just say real quickly that it was very intentional that I did ethnography. And, as a social scientist, you can collect data and do research in lots of different ways. But I'm very much interested in storytelling, and I'm very much interested in books that are readable and I, that are I want them to be interesting and fun. And I like for people to really be able to see the participants come through in the story. And if you have ever read if you read about maybe a survey, we did a survey of 8,000 people and they said they like this, that, and the other thing. You don't get the story behind, you don't get the story of the people behind that data. And that data, and that's fine. That data serves an important purpose, but I wanted to show the story of the people behind the research. And that's why I do ethnography. And so one of the things that Wendy and Katlin asked me to talk about today is sort of my relationship to writing. And I think that right there, doing an ethnography was very much about me really liking storytelling and writing. And so that was why I did ethnography as opposed to other methods. So I'll say real quickly, why am I interested in gender and sexuality? I think it started with in being in women's studies, that you learn about. So I knew growing up as a girl, and and when I was growing up, we didn't have terms like cisgender and transgender. There were transgender people, but we didn't have that word to describe transgender people. But growing up as a girl in a patriarchal society where I experienced sexism, I wanted to understand, why is it that I'm treated differently than boys, and what's that about? And so you do a lot of that in women and gender studies. You sort of start to figure that stuff out. And one of the many sort of ways to answer that question, and there's lots of different ways to answer sort of what is sexism, but one of the ways that people sort of explore that topic is to ask, what is gender? Like, what makes a girl and a boy? And is there really such thing? And that was really, really interesting to me always. And partially because I was a tomboy. I grew up a tomboy. I was never quite like a good girl. I was never good at being a girl. According to kind of society's norms. And so that was always and yet I was, and I didn't feel as if I wasn't a girl like that, and so it was sort of like trying to figure that out, why, what is a girl and what is a boy and what do these things mean? And that's a question that a sociologist can answer really well. And so, and then, those things are very, very deeply interlinked with sexuality. Gender and sexuality are very intertwined. And so I also was interested in what that had to do with sexuality, both, all of the ways that we're sexual, our sexual identification, the sexual behavior we engage in, how we feel about our sexualities. So that was sort of what drew me. I just was continuously interested in sort of how do we become a girl, or how do you become a boy, or how do you become a genderqueer person, and where is what's the social story about that? So that kind of gives you some idea of how I got to where I got in the research. And there was a question, one of the questions that Wendy and Katlin asked me to answer was sort of like, what's some of the cool work that I've done, cool projects I've been involved in. And I'll tell you that like the coolest thing I do is teach college students. Like I really love teaching, and I love students, and I love the college level. I'm always in awe of K-12 teachers, because I'm just like, how do you do it every day? How do you have, they have so many more students than we do, and they teach every day. And I just am, I don't know, like that is not something that I can see myself doing, but I really love college students because you're more independent, and you're more you're adults and you're in a place of, especially I think at community college, you're in a place of like, I want to be here, I want to be learning, I'm pursuing this thing. And it's just a transformative, fun moment in people's lives. I think it's a really exciting time to be in college and sort of be having your mind blown into, about all of this new stuff that you're learning. So that's probably the coolest thing that I do. And, but I will say that, this project, this ethnography, it was very, very difficult and it took a lot of time. It took me, just the research itself took about 3 years. And I was in graduate school and teaching. And so it was like a third job, and it was, I was tired and it was really scary, and I didn't know if I was doing it right. And I was always afraid I was going to misrepresent the people I was working with. And, so it was really, really hard, but it was really, really cool. And when I go back and read the book and share the book like I am with you, I loved being at Spectrum and I loved that experience. And it's just one of the it's a highlight of my life that I'll always remember. I got to do some radio interviews. When the book came out, I got to be on a couple of radio interviews. That was cool. And I visited a museum in San Antonio, Texas, invited me to come talk because they had this exhibition called Trans American that was about gender and society, and I got to go do that. So it's given me some cool opportunities. That's a lot. So I haven't kept up with the chat. So I just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions. So how about, is this a good moment for me to kind of pause and see if people have questions and check in with all of you?
That's great, Mary. Does anyone have questions that you might post in the chat or speak aloud? I see something in the Q&A.
Yep, and I can see it.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. Okay, so I'll read it just in case. I'm intrigued by you and your story and inspired to go back to apply for grad school. How is data of life histories of folks you interviewed compiled and translated in an ethnography? When I think of data, I hear numbers and statistics, not storytelling. Super great question. So data is data is information, right? And so data can be numbers. And I do think we most often associate data with numbers, like statistics and graphs and the census. We just had a big decennial census, so you all know those kinds of, like, that's what we associate with data. But data can also be other, and the term we use is qualitative. So numbers are quantitative data. Qualitative data is other stuff. And so by other stuff, that can be stories. And when I say stories, I kind of mean, that can be interviews, that could be open-ended questions on surveys. That could be some of the really cool stuff people are doing are things like photo voice, where you give cameras to people and they take, and ask them a question or research question, and then they take pictures to represent their answer to a question. There's content analysis where, for example, you might look through newspaper articles, you might look for, key terms or tags in newspaper articles, magazines. Did you see how I did newspaper articles as if we still read newspapers? Anyway, newspapers, magazines, photographs, audio and video recordings can be qualitative data. So actually most data in the world is actually qualitative data. And then the numbers is quantitative data. And so what you do, what the process looks like in an ethnography is, first of all, is this idea of immersion, that you go spend time in the community where you're doing your research. And sometimes for some people that means like living in that community 24 hours a day for months, if not years. In my situation, it was just hanging out, several days a week. And so my data was, I've mentioned field notes. And so I would hang out and be in community with these folks. And with my training, so, I'm getting trained as a graduate student in sociology and how sociologists understand the world. So with my training, I'm paying attention to certain things, and then I would write notes about what I'm observing. So it wasn't like, oh, Wendy, I can't believe she was late today. She's such a jerk. It would be like, oh, Wendy, Wendy's wearing makeup today, but she didn't wear makeup last week. And why is she wearing makeup today? It's this kind of, you're like just paying attention to what's happening that's specific to your research question and writing field notes. But it's literally like, these are all the things that happened to me today while I was at Rainbow Alley. This happened and this happened, or Spectrum. This happened and this happened and this happened. And you're taking just these really specific descriptive notes of what's going on. That's one bit. And then the interviews. So then the interviews are recorded and transcribed. And so I would sit down with the youth. And of course, there's a process there in that you create a survey. You create an interview guide and a questionnaire. And there's a whole lot of process that goes into all of this. But the interviews, you record them and transcribe them, and those transcriptions. So everyone, what happened in the interview, the conversation that I had with the person in the interview is also data. And then I could use things like, I didn't do a photo study, but I noticed, you notice from if you read the chapter, like I'm describing the space that we're in, like what did it look like? Where did people sit? Was there art on the walls? What kinds of things were going on? So all that descriptive stuff, the interviews, the writing down for my field notes, all of that is data. And you do what's called coding, and there's a process of coding where you go back through it after you collect your data. As you collect your data, you go back through it and code for themes and things that you notice. And so, for example, I would be noticing, y'all read chapter 4, so I would be noticing, people keep talking about anime and people keep talking about Sailor Moon, and why is this important? So you're sort of noticing when a topic comes up over and over again. And then you have these themes based on your codes that's where the analysis comes in. So you need this kind of a bit of the field that you're in, whether you're an anthropologist or a sociologist or a public health person, you have a little bit of that kind of scientific background, but then you take the qualitative data and you analyze it and then write about it. And then, real quickly, I'll just say that it's important to understand that qualitative data is not a causal data. Like I can't say X caused Y with qualitative data. That's not what qualitative data does. The way you can with quantitative data, you can get close to saying, if you're not wearing a mask, you're going to get exposed to a virus, right? Like quantitative data can sort of tell you. Qualitative data is not there to say X caused Y. Qualitative there is to describe what is happening. So I hope that helps. So Amy asked, can you walk us through the process of starting with a big idea, then designing a project that is a practical scale, yet comes back to truly addressing the big idea? Yeah, it's such a challenge. So this is the process. I know. And what I just described, I made it sound very easy in a way, but there's like all these steps that I'm leaving out because it's a lot. But the first step in designing a research project is deciding what your research question is. And I think in Amy's point there was really important that, you often start with this really big idea, which is like, why are some people gay and some people straight? Like that's a really big, giant question, right? And so that's the big idea. And then, but then if you want to go answer that question, you can't answer that question. You can't even answer that question with quantitative data, right? It's way too big. And so, and then Amy's like, how do you do that practically? So that's even more important because the reality, remember when I said like, the reason I'm a sociologist is because they gave me money and the anthropology didn't give me money. And the same type of thing happens when you're a graduate student doing research, is that you have to do a research project that is doable. You have to do something that you can get done in the amount of time you have available to do what you want to do. And so there is this practicality question of like, okay, I want to know, why are some people gay and some people are straight? That's too big. How can I narrow that down to something that I could actually accomplish and actually sort of try it, get closer to sort of answering in the time that I have available to me, so that I won't be a graduate student for 35 years. So the key to that is that you narrow down that research question till it's something that's answerable. And so in my case, and I don't even know if I'm going to use my case, because I don't think it's a great example, but you're going to see me struggling even as I'm talking about this, because the research question is so hard. It's so hard to get to a good research question that's answerable, because it's these really big ideas. So for me, okay, this is coming to me. I'm just trying to kind of think through this process. The other thing that happens is that your research question guides the methods that you use. So are you going to use quantitative data or qualitative data? Are you going to interview people? Are you going to create a survey? Are you going to do a photo voice project? That's very much determined by that research question that you're asking. So because I had this question that's like, how do people become gendered, or how do people become sexual? I needed to sort of observe that happening. I needed to be able to, because that was my question, then it was like, okay, well, the doable way to do that is that you have to be able to watch and watch people become gendered or become sexual. And so that research question pointed towards ethnography as being the best method, because ethnography is, as I just said, is watching and describing. And so then, but then you have to decide where you're going to do that. And it's like, where can I observe people becoming sexual or becoming gendered? And the answer is everywhere. Like it's happening around us all the time. But how do I do it in a contained place that is doable, a place that I can rely on, a place that is going to be consistent in sort of what I'm seeing, and that's not going to be too much. Like if I just went out on the street, there'd be so much going on and happening, it would be hard to contain. So you have to sort of find a contained place to answer that question. And so for me, it was like, well, teenagers, because teenagers aren't done yet in terms of figuring out who they are. I'm not done yet. I'm 48 and I'm not done yet in terms of my gender or sexuality, but teenagers are less done than adults. So teenagers would be great to be able to watch becoming, and an LGBT youth drop-in center, because it's a contained place where teenagers go to hang out. And then the added bonus, and then of course that they also are very specifically there because of gender and sexuality. So all of a sudden, instead of like going to Times Square and watching everybody in society do gender or sexuality, I've narrowed it down to this really perfect kind of like place where you can really observe it happening in a contained space that's manageable, that's not too big. And then even then it's a lot. And even then, taking field notes and doing interviews, I still have all of this observation and all this data, and you still have to make choices about, okay, what's important about what I'm seeing versus not important. And you get to make those choices as a researcher. It's all important ultimately, but like, what are you going to focus on? And again, that goes back to your research question. Well, if my research question is how do people become gender or sexual, then I'm not going to, talk about whether or not they were getting, dropping out of high school. You know what I mean? Like that wasn't the focus of even though that was really important. And that was something that was happening to these young people, is that they weren't completing high school, but that wasn't what I was particularly looking at. So I hope that helps a little bit. And then ultimately, so then I do this book, and it's a very specific question about how do people become gender or sexual. But now the book goes into this big question, now the book contributes to our understanding. It's one little slice of understanding how we become gendered and sexual. Yeah. So would you provide an overview of notable findings from the study? Yeah, so the main things that I sort of zero in on are, one is that that we learn, and again, the research subjects in the book, the research participants in the book were youth who attended an LGBTQ drop-in center. And I want to make it really clear, that's not the same as saying the subjects in the book were LGBTQ youth, because some of them were and some of them weren't. So it was youth that attended this particular place. So the primary finding is that all of us, and I demonstrate it through the participants, but the finding sociologically is that all of us learn to do gender, and we learn to be sexual, that we're not born gendered or sexual, that we learn these things. And that doesn't mean we're not born with a reproductive system. It doesn't mean we're not born with physiological, like hormones and pheromones and things that make us help us to reproduce. But that when it comes to your sexual identity, when it comes to your desire, when it comes to how you have sex and who you have sex with, we learn that from society. So gender and sexuality are learned. That's like the primary finding of the book. Another important finding is, and I did a chapter on sexuality and a chapter on gender. So they kind of look at those two things. And then the chapter that was assigned for Wendy's class was that members of groups, people who are underrepresented groups in society, and so in this case, it was, for sure, queer people, LGBTQ people, but also, people who are not white, people who are working class or poor, people with disabilities, people who don't fit into the dominant mainstream society, have a hard time finding representations of themselves in mainstream media. And so I talk about how queer youth had to find other ways to find representations of their desires and their genders than mainstream media, because you wouldn't see same-sex couples, or you wouldn't see genderqueer youth in media. And I also talked about how the internet really sort of blew that up and made so that chapter is about, who gets represented in mainstream society, and if you're not represented, where do you go to find yourself? So those are but again, that ties back to this greater idea, which is like that we learn to be sexual and gendered and sexual. Yeah. These are great questions, y'all. Thank you for asking them.
That was a great response, Mary. And I thought also when I got to the end of the book that I don't know how to put this exactly, but the way you also discovered that sexual expression and gender expression is changing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And our definitions of, what's, just gay and straight or bisexual or whatever, those things are really changing.
Yeah.
And I would actually like to hear a little bit more about that.
Great.
What's happening to us as a culture? I was fascinated.
Yeah, thanks for that, Wendy, because that actually also is a really big overarching theme of the book, is that, kids aren't sexual or gender the way they used to be, right? That it changes. And that's part of that it's learned, is that it's a social construction. So when you have a social construction, gender is a social construction, meaning its meaning and the way we represent it in society changes across time and place. And so yeah, so one of the, the most fun parts of this book was noticing how kids today, how young people at this moment in time, it was the early to, the tens, yeah, it's like 2010 was kind of the moment. So that kids who grew up in the 90s and early 2000s are expressing their gender and sexuality and naming their gender and sexuality differently than kids like me who grew up in the 80s, or kids like my parents who grew up in the 50s, so that the language is changing and the terms we use and the way we understand sexuality. And so that was a really important piece of understanding that this is part of the learned part of the social part of sexuality and gender, is that if you, when I was a teenager, pansexual was not a word. Like one would not have been a pansexual person. Like that doesn't mean that there weren't people who felt and experienced desire for lots of different types of people, but there was no word for them to describe that. And so if you really like back up, the same thing can be said of prior to the gay pride, the gay pride movement, which was really like these moments in the 60s and 70s, and it goes back farther than that, but these big moments for us, the big marker is kind of the 60s and 70s of gay men and lesbian women coming together in groups. Like that wasn't, you didn't have a word to describe who you were to go find a community to be part of, prior to people starting to use the word gay to describe their sexualities. And so, and now it's just, we just completely in the United States take that for granted as like, that's an absolute thing. And there's, you can find gay everywhere, right? There's gay community and gay pride and gay restaurants and gay bars and, so it's, gay real estate companies, it becomes like totally the norm. So being able to say, okay, well, right now, what is it that what's new for us in this case, 2010, and what was really new was ideas around like fluidity, that one's sexuality was going to change over time across the course of their lives. You didn't have to just be, you didn't have to be straight or gay or bisexual forever. You could, that would change. And then that gender is on a spectrum, and that gender, you don't have to be a boy or a girl. You can also be gender queer or gender non-binary. You can be transgender, and again, with the emphasis being that those types of lived experiences have always existed. There's always been gender non-binary people and transgender people and gender queer people, but we didn't have that language to describe them, and they weren't visible. Oftentimes, depending on the culture, oftentimes they were invisible and not encouraged and hidden and stigmatized and in worst case scenario experience violence and harassment. So as of course is still the case. So yeah, it was like, okay, so what's happening now that's new and that's like different and changing? And for me, it was the explosion in terms to describe identity. So instead of you're gay or you're straight and you're lesbian, you could be there's all these terms to describe your sexuality, and then the trans spectrum. Those were kind of the two big things that were new. And then the fact that both that fluidity, that the young people that participated in my study weren't necessarily stuck on that you had to stay a particular way.
Thanks, Mary. We have time for one more question, and there's one more question in the chat. Do you have any recommendations for parents on how better to influence their children in their understanding and development of gender and sexuality?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think, if you like sociology and you like this kind of writing, I do recommend the book. I think it really does help parents understand, have kind of a better idea of what kids are experiencing today. And I've heard, I visited with a friend's class the other day, and she was telling me that she had a student who, while they read this book in her class, and while this student was in the class, the student who was a mother, her partner and their child all read the book, and while they're in the class, this child was discovering their sort of gender and thinking, and discovering themselves as a trans kid. And so, I think it's a place to start discussions. My book is by no means the only one. There are tons and tons of books, especially now, for parenting kids around gender. And they can be both, they don't have to be about transgender, right? They can be about just parenting kids and gender. And so I just really, and I think any decent bookstore can help you find those types of books. So I think books are such a great conversation places to talk to. It gives a parent sort of a starting place, and then it's a conversation place with kids. I think television, so finding shows that are for me, and what I would encourage are queer affirming, LGBTQ affirming television shows, books, stories that also give you an opportunity, or maybe you can watch a show together and then talk about, well, what did you think about this character and what was there, and so there are ways to sort of start conversations around your home about gender and sexuality. And I think if you're in a situation where you really feel like you need support, like maybe you have a kid who's really experiencing some big stuff and needs some support, then the LGBT youth centers are very common, especially in bigger cities, but they'll surprise you. Sometimes they're in smaller cities, smaller places too. You all are in San Diego, so the Hillcrest Center, I know, is a good resource. The Ocean Beach LGBTQ Center, it's the North County LGBTQ Center, is a great resource, at least when I was there. I would imagine they're still going strong. Those folks are very well equipped to help parents start conversation with kids. But again, I don't want to assume you have a kid that's queer, maybe that's not what's happening. But I think, I can just say, the more you can build up your ability to talk to your kids about gender and sexuality. So whatever you have to do, if that means reading books, watching shows, getting educated, going to workshops, the more that it's just about talking, being able to communicate to them about these things in a way that's not weird, which I think adults are really weird about talking to kids about these things. And then the final thing I would say, if I learned anything from this book, it's that, know that your kids care very, very, very much what you think, whether you think they do or not. And that if you're not affirming them, it hurts. And that it's, it's not a big deal. Like, it's okay for kids to be exploring their gender. It's okay for kids to be exploring their sexuality. Let's all work at helping them do that in a safe, healthy way and not freak out about it. And there's great resources, but to affirm them and be there for them, because they do care very much what you think.
That is the most wonderful note to end on, Mary. Thank you. And thank you for visiting us. And we know you're busy, but you came here and talked with us and
Such an honor.
told us the amazing story of your work. I love it.
Well, thank you all. It was such a blast. I appreciate being invited.
So everyone, stay tuned for, as a reminder, this coming Friday, we're featuring Mesa's own Jennifer Syme at 10 a.m. And I'd like to thank everyone who got up early this morning and came to see Mary and hear just the wonderfulness that she is. So,
thanks, y'all. Thanks for having me.
bye, everyone.